the gentleman from Idaho, who's certainly seen his share of forest fires in his state, Mr. Labrador.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing today. The topic we're discussing could not be more relevant to what is happening on the ground in Idaho right now. This year is one of the worst fire seasons in U.S. history. Nationwide, over 8.5 million acres have burnt, and in Idaho, almost 600,000 acres have burnt. Idahoans have suffered throughout a summer of terrible smoke, with air quality reaching unhealthy and even hazardous levels. I know that the lack of proper forest management by the federal government is not the sole cause of these fires, but the lack of management is definitely a major factor. Mr. Rigdon, do you consider yourself a science denier?
No, I don't.
No. Mr. Chilcutt, do you consider yourself a science denier? Mr. Fight, do you consider yourself a science denier?
I do not, Congressman.
All right, so Commissioner Chilcutt, when I travel throughout my district, I hear the same two things from my county commissioners. First, that they're scared that the unhealthy conditions of the federal forests that surround their communities pose a significant risk to the safety of their constituents. And second, that they are concerned about the impact that the lack of active management is having on their local economies. I believe that we can address both of these concerns by increasing active management on our federal forests. Do you believe that the lack of management has led to an overaccumulation of hazardous fuels in the forest?
Yes, sir, I do.
And that's because you deny science?
No, sir, I don't deny science.
Is this overaccumulation of hazardous fuels a safety threat in your county?
It is.
Why do you say that?
A threat to not only our public safety personnel who address the fires, fight the fires, evacuate the citizens, our respiratorily compromised population who has to leave our jurisdiction to find clean air and safe air, and the impact to our water and water quality, the impact to our economy through the loss of revenue from the tourism base, from the cost to local government to mitigate the impacts of the fire and to pay the personnel that are responding to the fire. That's why we need a partnership with our federal government and our state to better address the problems that are facing our citizens and our economies.
What impact would an increase in active management have on the fuel load and the economy in your county?
What impact
would it have? Active management, what would it do for your community? What would it do for the fuel load in the forest, and what would it do to your community?
Thank you, Congressman. Sorry for interrupting.
No, it's all right.
It would reduce the fuel load, increase jobs, enhance the economy, produce revenue for not only loggers or people on the ground, but also for the agency and for local government to produce revenue to create infrastructure and education opportunities for our students.
Thank you. Mr. Fight, opponents of active forest management offer the argument that fire is a natural part of the landscape, and therefore we should not manage the forest to prevent wildfires. In your written testimony, can you state that fires in actively managed forests actually behave more consistently with the historic role of fires in the ecosystems? Can you explain why this is the case?
Absolutely, Congressman, and that's because of a lack of active management and decades of fire suppression led fuels to build up well above the historic ranges, and the composition of forests are outside the historic range of variability. So when a fire comes through, it doesn't act like fire has historically. What it acts like is the catastrophic fires that we've seen. And in fact, the science bears this out. There's several scientific studies each year about the threat of mega fires, for example, to old forest species.
But your colleague sitting right next to you says the opposite, that science actually shows that active management increases the intensity of fires.
Well, I respectfully disagree, and I would point out we at the industry, we've worked with a lot of conservation-minded organizations, and that's because they're following the science to where we need to do active restoration work in a lot of our federal forests. And so I think that's, if you follow the broad stream of where the science is taking you without cherry picking, that's I think where you should end up.
Well, let's talk about cherry picking. Are you familiar with this chart that he just presented. If you look at, he says that between 1950 and 1980, there was less fires. Wasn't there more active management of forests between 1950 and 1980?
There was, Congressman.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now